Okay, in this video, I'm going to go through a little model very different from our supply and demand model. It's called the Laffer Curve, named after Art Laffer, which isn't spelled the way you might guess. It's spelled like this. And this is sort of a foundational kind of thing to what's often called supply side economics. This thing that I'm going to draw supposedly was first drawn on a napkin at a hotel bar. It's kind of neat in its simplicity and certain aspects of it that are kind of irrefutable. It's kind of neat like that. What we're looking at is a causal relationship in the control-dependent relationship that you're used to from algebra. And by that, I mean what we have, whoops, that's not my best. I think it'll work. What we have is down here at lowercase r, which I'm going to say is a tax rate. And what we have up here is an uppercase R, which I'm going to say is for revenue. And I'm talking about government revenue here. Now, with rates going up, revenue should go up, right? Charge more, get more. That's called the static view of taxes. Raise the rate, get more government revenue. But what we're going to see is called the dynamic view of tax revenue, or of tax rates. Take your pick, because they're related, aren't they? And here's how I think I can get us there. Ask yourself this. If the government charges nothing, no rate on whatever, income, sales, take your pick. If the rate is zero, what's government revenue from that tax source? Zero. Now, there could be some kind of a system where people could make donations, so maybe it's more than zero. But generally speaking, if the rate is zero, revenue is zero. And that's a point on this relationship that we're all familiar with. That's just the origin. We can count on that. Perhaps we could have some positive intercept, and the rate would have to be like a negative rate or something for it to be zero. But, you know, we don't really need to go there. Zero rate, zero revenue. Okay? Now, let's go to the other extreme. And again, it doesn't make too much difference what kind of a market we're taxing here. Let's go ahead and talk about income taxes, and we're taxing labor. That is you and me going to work. Let's suppose an extreme tax rate. I mean, we talk about high taxes, but let's get crazy. Let's suppose the tax rate is 100%. That means you and I, we go to work, and at the end of, 2 weeks, a pay period, we get a pay stub. And that is all. We get a pay stub that says what we would have made, and then we have the government taking away that same amount, and all we get is the stub. Now, how much revenue would the government raise with that tax rate? Most people are saying zero, but there are a few people who are saying, they'd still raise some revenue, because as long as my needs were met by those government services, I'd be content to work for nothing. And, truthfully, I might be one of those people. I don't think this is a good idea. I'll share that, but I might be one of those people because I like what I do. I'm not really loving doing it from my house, but I like what I do. I would actually do this for free if I had to. Glad they pay me. Don't tell them I would do it for free. But I would, because I like it. So that would mean that if there are people like me who would work for free just because they enjoy what they do, if they could, the government could have revenue at 100% tax rate on income taxes. That is true. So let's get really crazy and suggest this. What if the tax rate was 120% on income taxes? What I'm suggesting is, what if you went to work and you made $1,000, except that the government took the entire $1,000 and then sent you a bill for $200 just because you made $1,000? That would be 120% tax rate. How much government revenue would there be from income taxes with a tax rate like that? I think we all have to acknowledge that at some extreme rate, the revenue take is certain to be zero. If it was sales tax, I was picking on the income tax. Let's say the sales tax. What if the sales tax rate was 100% instead of 6%? You buy something for $10, you pay $10, and then you have to hand over another $10 for the government. There'd still be some revenue. Let's say it was 200%. You buy a MacBook for $2,000, and then you write a check to the government for another $4,000. So it costs you $6,000 to buy a $2,000 item. Would the government get revenue from something like that? Another way to phrase that question is, how much is the British tea tax revenue from the United States today? 0. Something will break where you cannot charge a rate at such a high rate as that, because your tea will end up in some harbor and you're going to get dragged into a war. And even if you don't acknowledge that you lose that war, you get dragged into a second war, and you're still getting 0 tax from your colonies when you charge a rate above some threshold. It doesn't matter what market it is, it doesn't matter what kind of tax it is. There's always too high of a rate where something is going to break, and you're not going to get any revenue from it. If I have a 0 here and a 0 here, and we know that governments do raise revenue with tax rates, we do. I mean, that's how the governments in our country raise revenues every day. There are positive numbers in between 2 zeros. So what necessarily must be taking place here? Unquestionably, there's some kind of a trade happening where there is a maximum between the 0 and the 0. Now, it could be a zigzag. It could be linear, straight line until it plummets. And I suspect if you were to model the T-tax rates leading up to them falling to 0 for Britain, maybe it looked like that. I don't know the shape, and it would depend. It's not really important. What is important is that there is a 0 and a 0 and positive numbers in between, so there must be some rate at which the revenue is at its maximum. And we might call this optimum. That's R opt for the optimal rate. I actually don't really like the idea of calling it optimum, and I'll explain why in a minute. That means then there's also an R max. It is the most revenue that can be had from taxing this good or service. And what that implies then is that if you're charging a rate as a government somewhere too far above the revenue maximizing rate, cutting taxes, that is if you're taxing, like, let's say here, that means your revenue is only like here. So how can you raise revenue? You cut taxes. And that pushes revenue up to what it can be. That's the supply side argument for cutting taxes. That was the argument used for the Bush tax cuts in 2002 and 2003. That was the argument for the Reagan tax cuts. That was effectively the outcome of the Kennedy tax cuts, although this model wasn't made until the early 80s, so it wasn't modeled this way. It was just what was done. That was also, I never heard discussion about the model. That was also the basis for the Trump corporate tax cuts, corporate tax rates. To raise revenue, the argument was to bring that money home from abroad and all those kinds of things. Now, at question is the time frame. This is static in the sense that it's at one time. It's dynamic in the sense that this isn't a straight line. Static tax analysis assumes you can just raise the rate forever and rates would go up and up. It's dynamic because it changes. The return or the revenue changes as the rate changes. So it's dynamic tax analysis. But it's static in the sense that you're only looking at one time period, right here, right now. And really, this arrow isn't expected to happen immediately. It happens over time. As the market expands, think back to our deadweight loss, as the market expands, the revenue can rise. So that's one problem with the model, is we don't know when to expect these tax hikes, tax decreases to raise revenue if we're charging above what some people call the optimum rate. Of course, then the other side is if we're not actually above the optimum rate, then we wouldn't expect to see the tax revenue rise at all, because then we would just be moving this way and down our curve, and revenue would fall if we were actually below this rate. So we have to have some idea of where we are, and there's nothing to sort that out that I know of other than political debate. But then I wanted to circle back to something I said about this optimizing rate, what people might call the optimizing rate. I don't really like calling it that because recessions do happen. The economy ebbs and flows. And when a recession happens, depending on the type of market that we're talking about, government revenues fall. Because if it's income taxes, people are laid off, that's fewer incomes to tax. If it's sales taxes, people are buying and selling less, that falls off. I don't know of any kind of revenue from governments that rises with a recession. I can't think of a single example. It's not good for governments either. Okay? That means that revenues are falling at all possible rates. So this curve is going to fall during bad economic times. Well, if you were holding out as a government saying, we are right at the revenue optimizing rate, and that's where we want to be, if that's where you are, and your curve falls during a recession, then all that you can count on for sure is your revenue falling, and there's nothing you can do about that. Whereas if you were here or here, I think here would be more optimal, because chugging along here doesn't make much sense, because that's going through life, having the ability to cut taxes, put more money in people's pockets, and raise revenue. So it doesn't make sense to try to be off of optimum, I think, to the right of it. It does make sense, I think, to be, this is me, to be off of optimum to the left of it, because if you go into recession, you do have the option of raising taxes to raise revenues. Whereas this is the revenue maximizing rate already in recession. You don't have that option at all. Your hands are tied as a policymaker as far as tax rates go. So I would think that the optimal place would be somewhere left of our revenue maximizing tax rate. But that's just sort of my take on it. I'm hoping by elaborating on that, not so much to sell you on my thinking, but to help you get you thinking about this, and maybe even help make the thing make more sense.